Right now, the United States is about to go through something that almost never happens in exactly this way. Not one weather event, not one storm system, not one heat wave, all of it at once, stacked on top of each other, hitting different parts of the country at the exact same time. On one side of the map, the air itself is about to turn into a weapon. Numbers climbing so high that when you first hear them, you assume someone made a mistake. Not the heat index, not the feels-like temperature with humidity mixed in, the actual air temperature. The kind of heat that turns a steering wheel into something you cannot touch. The kind that makes asphalt soft enough to leave footprints. The kind that can put a healthy adult in the hospital in under an hour if they are not careful. And while that is happening on one side of the country, something completely different is assembling itself on the other side. A machine that produces storms, one after another, day after day, hammering the same communities over and over until nerves are frayed and roofs are torn open. We're talking about violent winds strong enough to peel siding off a house. We're talking about hail large enough to shatter windshields. And yes, we're talking about tornadoes, the real kind, the kind that can turn a neighborhood into splinters in under a minute. But here's the part almost nobody's talking about yet. Hiding behind the heat and hiding behind the storms is a third danger, one that does not show up in dramatic footage, one that does not trend on social media the way a tornado does, and it might end up being the most dangerous piece of this entire pattern. I will walk you through exactly what that is later in this video, so stay with me. Before I go any further, if breakdowns like this actually help you understand what is happening instead of just frightening you, that is exactly what this channel is built for. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because this pattern is going to keep evolving over the coming days, and some of what I'm about to tell you could shift by the time the weekend actually arrives. When it does shift, I want you to be among the first to know, not from a panicked headline after the fact, but from a clear explanation before it happens. So let's get into it, because once you understand how all three pieces of this system connect to each other, you will understand exactly why meteorologists across the country are watching their screens right now with a level of focus you do not see very often. This is one of those rare stretches where every major ingredient lines up simultaneously. The heat feeds the storms. I want you walking away from this video with a complete picture, not scattered headlines, not fragments. The whole story laid out clearly enough that you know exactly what to expect, where to expect it, and what you personally should be doing about it. Because there are moments when a few days of advance warning is the difference between a stressful week and a genuinely dangerous one. Let's start with the heat, because that is where everything else in this story begins. Picture a massive dome of hot air parked directly over the middle of the country, and picture it simply refusing to move. Think of it the way you would think of a pot on a stove with a heavy lid clamped down over it. Turn up the burner, seal the lid, and the contents inside just keep building in temperature because there is nowhere for that heat to escape. That is essentially what is sitting over the central and southern plains right now. The wind cannot push it out of the way. The clouds cannot break through it from above. All that heat just sits there day after day, cooking everything underneath it. And the numbers this setup is capable of producing are genuinely extreme. Across parts of the southern plains, high temperatures are expected to approach the range of 112 to 116 degrees. Sit with that figure for a second, because a temperature like that is not a hot summer afternoon. That is not the kind of heat where you shrug and say it is a scorcher outside. That is the kind of heat where health officials start pleading with people to stay indoors entirely. That is the kind of heat where roads can physically buckle, where the electrical grid gets pushed toward its breaking point from air conditioners running nonstop, and where a person can go from feeling fine to feeling seriously ill just from walking across a parking lot. And this is not a single bad afternoon, which is exactly what makes it so much more dangerous than it might sound at first. If this were one rough day, your body could absorb it. You would drink some extra water, stay inside for a bit, and be perfectly fine by the next morning. But this heat is not planning on leaving quickly. It is expected to hold its grip for the better part of a week before a real break finally arrives. Day after day, temperatures barely retreat, and that includes overnight. Under a heat dome like this one, nighttime temperatures often stay uncomfortably warm too, which means your body never actually gets the recovery window it needs. You go to sleep hot, you wake up hot, and the next day starts from an already elevated baseline before the sun has even fully risen. Multiply that across a full week, and you start to understand why prolonged heat waves like this one are so physically dangerous, especially for elderly residents, for outdoor workers, for anyone without reliable air conditioning. Here is something I genuinely want you to sit with, because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this entire forecast. Heat does not look scary. It does not produce the kind of dramatic video footage that a tornado ripping through a subdivision produces, or that a hurricane slamming into a coastline produces. Nobody puts heat on the evening news the same way they put a funnel cloud on the evening news. But heat quietly kills more people across the United States in an average year than tornadoes, hurricanes, and flooding combined. That is not an exaggeration for effect. That is simply what the numbers show year after year. And the reason it kills so many people, despite looking so unremarkable, is precisely because people underestimate it. They assume they can push through it. They assume a hot day is just a hot day. And then, sometimes with very little warning, they find themselves in a genuine medical emergency. So if you live anywhere across the central or southern plains this week, please take this seriously. Check in on elderly neighbors and relatives. Make sure any pets have shade and fresh water throughout the day. Never, under any circumstance, leave a child or an animal inside a parked vehicle, not even for what feels like just a minute. When the outside air is sitting at 115 degrees, the interior of a parked car can climb past 150 degrees in well under 15 minutes, and that kind of heat can be fatal extremely quickly. Drink water before you actually feel thirsty, because thirst is already a lagging signal. Limit outdoor exertion. During the hottest stretch of the afternoon whenever you can, and if you must be outside, take frequent breaks in shade and watch for warning signs like dizziness, confusion, or nausea. Your body is very good at telling you when something is wrong. The trick is actually listening to it before it becomes an emergency. Now here is where this story takes an interesting turn, because that same dome of heat sitting over the middle of the country is not just cooking the ground beneath it. So when one region gets extraordinarily hot, the surrounding air starts to react. It rushes inward. It rises rapidly. And where that rising hot air meets cooler air pushing in from another direction, the atmosphere becomes unstable in a hurry. Now picture the edge of that heat dome, the boundary where the scorching air to the south meets much cooler air riding in from the northwest along the jet stream, which you can think of as a fast-moving river of wind high up in the atmosphere. Right along that boundary is where nearly all of the violent weather in this pattern is going to be generated. The hot air is pumping enormous amounts of moisture and energy upward. The jet stream is dragging in cooler, drier air and stronger winds from the opposite direction. And where those two forces collide, the atmosphere essentially becomes a pressure cooker with nowhere left to release its energy except straight upward in the form of towering, explosive thunderstorms. This is exactly why, while the southern plains bake under genuinely dangerous heat, the northern plains, the upper Midwest, and the Great Lakes region are simultaneously getting hit by round after round of severe storms. Same underlying pattern, same root cause, two completely different disasters depending entirely on where you happen to live. Let me walk you through how this plays out over the coming days, because the timing here actually matters quite a bit. Over the next day or two, the first significant wave of storms rolls across the upper Midwest, moving from around Iowa up through Minnesota and into Wisconsin and Michigan. Thunderstorms become widespread through the afternoon and into the evening hours. The primary threat with this initial round is straight-line wind, meaning wind that blows with tremendous force in essentially one direction, strong enough to snap utility poles, flip unsecured outdoor furniture, and send debris flying with real force. Large hail is also a concern, particularly farther west, where storms can build especially tall and especially intense. I want to flag something specific here. The official tornado risk for this initial wave is officially rated low, and it genuinely is low, but low is not the same thing as zero. There is a corridor stretching from around central Iowa up toward central Wisconsin, where near-surface winds are expected to shift and strengthen later in the afternoon. When that kind of shift happens, even an ordinary-looking thunderstorm can occasionally begin rotating. It does not happen on most days like this one, but it remains possible, and if you live anywhere in that corridor, having a reliable way to receive weather alerts on your phone is genuinely the smartest precaution you can take. Meanwhile, along parts of the East Coast, a separate cluster of storms is expected to develop during the afternoon hours as well. The stretch running from around the Ohio Valley eastward toward the mid-Atlantic could see scattered thunderstorms with some strong wind gusts mixed in. The tornado risk in that corridor is very low, but during a hot, humid afternoon in the middle of summer, the atmosphere can occasionally throw a curveball. A brief, fast-forming tornado, the kind that spins up and dissipates within minutes, is never entirely impossible when the surrounding air is this saturated with moisture. So stay reasonably alert, even in areas where the official risk looks minimal. Farther south and west, in the desert southwest, monsoon season remains in full swing. Repeated rounds of heavy rainfall are likely, and flash flooding remains a real concern in the usual low-lying trouble spots. If you live near a wash, arroyo, or canyon in that part of the country, you already understand the drill. Stay well away from low terrain whenever heavy rain starts falling, because water in those areas can rise with startling speed. The quietest day in this entire stretch tends to land roughly midweek, and I think it is worth saying plainly that not every single day inside an active weather pattern is going to be dramatic. On that quieter day, storm activity mostly shifts toward the interior northeast, with Pennsylvania and upstate New York being the main areas to watch. Scattered thunderstorms could bring gusty winds and isolated hail during the afternoon hours, and there is a narrow window in the evening where a brief, fast tornado in that region is not completely off the table, though overall this day functions more as a breather before the more significant event still to come. And that more significant event is the day everyone in the weather community has their attention locked onto. Out of every single day inside this entire pattern, this is the one carrying the highest potential. And I want to be careful about what I mean by that phrase because it matters. I'm not telling you that this day is guaranteed to be catastrophic. I'm telling you that the necessary ingredients for something genuinely significant are lining up, and if they come together the way several computer models are currently suggesting, this could turn into a serious, severe weather day across the upper Midwest. Here is what is actually happening under the surface. By this point in the pattern, both the upper-level winds high in the atmosphere and the near-surface winds closer to the ground are expected to be strengthening simultaneously. The upper winds shift from a northwesterly direction toward a more westerly direction, and while that might sound like a minor technical detail, it is actually a very big deal. When upper-level winds blow from the west, while lower-level winds blow from the south, the atmosphere begins to twist with height, and that twisting motion is precisely the ingredient that the most dangerous category of thunderstorm needs in order to form. That storm type is called a supercell. I know that sounds almost like something out of a science fiction movie, but it is a legitimate meteorological term describing a thunderstorm that develops its own internal rotating engine. Supercells are capable of producing extremely large hail and strong long-track tornadoes, and the atmosphere on this particular day is shaping up to hand these storms almost everything they could possibly want. The amount of available energy for storms to draw from is expected to be enormous, the kind of number that makes even seasoned forecasters pause and take a second look. Across parts of the upper Midwest, the atmosphere could be loaded with so much fuel that storms will not need much of a trigger to explode into severe intensity. Here is roughly how that day could unfold. The morning may start out relatively calm, perhaps with a few scattered showers and nothing especially alarming. But the afternoon deserves close attention, because that is typically when conditions shift rapidly. One or two supercells could develop across the northern part of the region during the afternoon hours. As evening approaches, additional storms may fire and eventually merge into a long, organized line of thunderstorms, sweeping across the region almost like a wall. If that happens, cities across the upper Midwest and Great Lakes could be dealing with severe weather well into the overnight hours, with damaging wind as the primary concern, along with the possibility of hail and an isolated tornado threat earlier in the storm's evolution, before everything organizes into that solid line. I want to spend a moment on this specific detail, because overnight, severe weather is genuinely one of the most underappreciated dangers in all of meteorology. Think about the difference between a daytime storm and a nighttime storm. During daylight hours, you can watch a storm approaching. You can see the sky darkening. You can notice if the clouds take on that unsettling greenish tint. You could potentially see rotation forming if a tornado is developing. You have a visual warning system built right into your own eyes. At night, none of that is available to you. All you have is sound, the wind picking up outside, thunder rolling, maybe the power flickering out while you sit in total darkness as the house creaks and shifts around you. That alone is unsettling. But it is also genuinely more dangerous because most people are asleep during these hours. They are not watching the sky. They might sleep through a warning siren entirely. And if their phone is not configured correctly to deliver emergency alerts, they may not even learn a warning has been issued until the danger has already passed through their area. This is exactly why, if you live anywhere across the upper Midwest or Great Lakes this week, today is the day to check your phone's emergency alert settings before the more active period arrives. If you own a weather radio, put fresh batteries in it now, and take a few minutes to actually decide where in your home you would go if you needed to shelter at 2 a.m. A basement remains the safest option where available. An interior room on the lowest floor, away from windows, is the next best choice. Having an actual plan, decided in advance, removes a huge amount of panic from the equation if the moment ever actually arrives. Once that major line of storms finally clears the region, a cold front typically punches through right behind it, and this is where the pattern takes its next dramatic swing. Behind that front, temperatures often crash in a way that feels almost unbelievable given how hot things were just days earlier. Areas that were sitting comfortably in the 90s and low 100s can suddenly see highs drop into the 60s and 70s, and across the far northern plains, overnight lows in a few spots could flirt with numbers in the 30s. That kind of temperature swing within the span of just a few days is genuinely remarkable, and it is a useful reminder of just how extreme and varied weather across the United States can be. Very few countries on Earth experience this range of conditions within the same week, in the same general region, all driven by a single connected weather pattern. Scorching desert-level heat, violent rotating thunderstorms, and near-freezing overnight temperatures, all tracing back to the same root cause. For anyone farming in the far northern reaches of this region, Those cooler overnight readings are worth watching closely, since unusually cold nights at this point in the growing season can place stress on certain crops. Even if an outright freeze does not materialize, it is simply a reminder that the transition toward autumn can sometimes arrive abruptly rather than gradually. Now, let me shift to the strangest piece of this entire story, because it involves something happening far offshore that most people are not paying any attention to at all right now, and it has everything to do with the tropics. Out over the Atlantic Ocean, things are unusually quiet. And I do not simply mean a little bit quiet, I mean noticeably, almost eerily quiet for this stretch of the hurricane season. By this point in the calendar, you would typically expect to see at least some organized tropical activity brewing, disturbances rolling off the African coast, systems attempting to spin up over warm open water, something showing signs of development. Right now, there is remarkably little happening, and there is a specific reason behind that stillness. A strong atmospheric pattern is currently suppressing tropical development by increasing wind shear across large stretches of the Atlantic basin. Remember how I described wind shear earlier? The way changing wind speed and direction with height can actually help organize a thunderstorm into a rotating supercell over land. Over open tropical water, that same kind of shear tends to do the exact opposite. Instead of helping a storm organize itself, it tears the storm apart before it can strengthen. Picture trying to stack blocks into a tower while someone keeps knocking them sideways. Tropical systems need calm, well-organized conditions in order to develop and intensify. And right now, the upper atmosphere over the Atlantic is anything but calm. Every time a disturbance attempts to organize, that shear rips it apart before it has a real chance to become anything significant. On the surface, that sounds like unambiguous good news, and in a lot of ways it genuinely is. Fewer storms forming right now means fewer immediate threats to the East Coast and Gulf Coast. But there is a catch buried underneath that good news, and it is worth understanding. All of that warm water sitting across the Atlantic is not simply disappearing. The ocean has spent the entire summer absorbing heat, and because no storms have come along to churn that water up and release the stored energy, the warmth just keeps accumulating layer upon layer. The water keeps getting warmer, and the available energy keeps building quietly beneath the surface. So the real question becomes what happens later in the season, perhaps in September or into October, if that suppressive wind shear finally relaxes enough to let a disturbance break through and organize. A storm forming under those conditions would suddenly have access to an enormous reservoir of stored ocean energy, and it could intensify extremely quickly, sometimes going from a relatively minor system to a major hurricane within just a couple of days. That kind of rapid intensification ranks among the most dangerous scenarios in all of tropical meteorology, because it leaves communities with almost no lead time to prepare properly. History offers plenty of examples of quiet hurricane seasons that ultimately produced only a small handful of storms, yet one or two of those storms turned into absolute monsters. It genuinely only takes one. That is exactly why, even with the Atlantic looking calm and uneventful right now, nobody who studies this field professionally is letting their guard down even slightly. I will continue watching the tropics closely throughout the rest of the season, and if anything begins to show signs of organizing out there, you will hear about it here well before it becomes a mainstream headline. For the moment, just remember that a quiet ocean does not automatically mean a safe ocean. It often just means the underlying energy is quietly building while it waits for the right opportunity. I know I've covered an enormous amount of ground in this video. Extreme heat, a multi-day severe storm outbreak, tornado risk, flash flooding, a dramatic temperature crash, and a deceptively quiet hurricane season with a hidden catch. That is genuinely a lot to keep track of all at once, so let me pull everything back together into one simple, coherent picture before we wrap up. When you step back far enough to see the whole system from above, there is really only one central character driving this entire story, and that is the heat dome sitting over the middle of the country. Everything else in this forecast essentially revolves around it. That dome produces the extreme dangerous temperatures across the central and southern plains. Its northern edge, where all that trapped heat collides with cooler air and stronger winds aloft, produces the daily rounds of severe thunderstorms across the upper Midwest and Great Lakes. Those repeated storms, hitting many of the same communities over and over, produce the flash flooding risk that quietly builds underneath all the more dramatic headlines. And eventually, a cold front finally breaks through, ending the heat, but not before delivering a genuinely dramatic temperature crash that carries parts of the country from summer-level extremes to something closer to early autumn within the span of just a few days. It is all connected. One underlying pattern, one root cause, several very different dangers branching off from it depending entirely on where you happen to be standing. That interconnected nature is exactly what makes this particular stretch of weather so unusual. Most weeks, we are dealing with one significant threat at a time. This week, several genuine threats are unfolding simultaneously, each one demanding its own kind of attention. So here is what I want you to actually walk away with. If you live across the central or southern plains, take the heat seriously, even though it does not look as dramatic as a tornado on camera. It is, in the most literal statistical sense, more dangerous. Stay hydrated throughout the day, limit time outdoors during peak afternoon hours. Check in on neighbors, especially elderly residents living alone. And never, under any circumstance, leave a person or a pet inside a parked vehicle, even for what feels like a brief moment. If you live across the upper Midwest, the Great Lakes, or the Ohio Valley, treat every afternoon and evening this week as a moment to stay genuinely weather aware. Make sure your phone's emergency alerts are switched on. Decide in advance where you would shelter if a warning arrived in the middle of the night. Pay particularly close attention to the day I highlighted as carrying the highest overall potential, especially across the upper Midwest. And if storms do move through overnight, make sure you have a backup plan beyond just your phone, since a weather radio with fresh batteries can wake you when a silenced phone might not. If you live anywhere that could see heavy rainfall later in the week, remember the simplest and most important rule in all of flood safety. Turn around, do not drown. A flooded roadway is never a shortcut, it is a trap. And it takes remarkably little moving water to sweep a vehicle off the pavement entirely. And if you live along the Atlantic coastline, do not let a quiet stretch of tropical weather lull you into a false sense of security. The season is far from finished, and the ocean is quietly storing up the very energy that could fuel a serious storm later on. I also want to be completely honest with you about one more thing, because I genuinely believe that honesty matters more than sounding certain about every detail. Some pieces of this forecast I feel very confident about. The extreme heat and the initial rounds of storms fall firmly into that category. The more significant severe weather threat later in the week carries real potential, and the ceiling on that day is genuinely high, but exactly how it plays out on the ground still carries a fair amount of uncertainty. The flash flooding risk toward the middle of next week is a real concern worth watching, but it is not something I would call locked in just yet. And the hint of another storm system potentially developing further down the road remains exactly that for now, a hint, nothing more concrete. As the days progress, some of these threats will likely grow more defined while others may fade away entirely. And I will be right here updating you as the picture continues to sharpen. That is really the nature of a forecast like this one. It is never a single, fixed prediction locked in stone. It is an evolving story that keeps developing in real time, and sometimes the difference between a manageable day and a genuinely dangerous one comes down to catching a small shift in the forecast just a few hours before it matters. So stay close this week, because this is exactly the kind of stretch where paying attention actually pays off.